Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThoughts, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games, and today we're going to be talking about Inscryption, one of the most recent roguelike card games to come out, or is it? And that immediately makes Inscryption a very hard game to review because it is a lot more than it shows. It is a lot more than the screenshots or the videos on their Steam page. It's a game that, at the risk of underselling itself, chooses to hide its true nature, and I think that's quite cool. I'm gonna try and explain this while also explaining the story and also while trying to spoil the minimum as possible. And so, Inscryption starts off as a roguelike card game where you're seemingly forced to play the card game with this mysterious figure who seems to have kidnapped you. So you're forced to play this game, of course, like I already mentioned, and also at the same time try to escape. And that is already by itself a very unique setting or a very unique premise, with the idea of playing this already fairly fleshed out roguelike game and also having this completely outside game of trying to escape, which ends up affecting the roguelike game itself. But to understand this, let's first understand how the roguelike game works. Basically, being very inspired by traditional TCG games with what I think is, and I'm definitely a bit biased here, Yu-Gi-Oh being the main inspiration with the way the layout of the cards is set up and the way they are summoned. But also there's a more dead giveaway much later on in the game that I'm not gonna spoil. It's a great moment in the game and it's almost towards the end. But let's just say it leaves no room for doubt on its Yu-Gi-Oh inspiration. Regardless, getting back to the mechanics of it, here you draw a certain amount of cards at the beginning of the turn, and then each turn you draw a card, and each turn you can summon as many monsters as you want. The monsters here, they're very stylistic depending on what you're doing. There's certain types of animals, like there'll be feral animals, which are bears and wolves. Then there'll be like birds, and they're birds. What do you expect? They can fly, that's their thing. And this might actually seem boring and simple, but I will say that the designs of the cards themselves and some of the things they do with the cards, like for example, in this first part of the game, some of the cards actually talk to you. They are sentient to some extent, and that adds to the mystery of the game on how these cards are sentient and how they are aware of what's going on in this game and the person you're playing with. So, it adds this whole new layer to it when you draw them in the game or whenever, some kind of contextual thing happens that allows them to commentate on it and maybe give you a bit of a clue. Regardless, most monsters do follow a certain rule, and that being the stronger they are, the more expensive they are to put on the field, having a need to sacrifice more monsters already on the field, kinda like tribute summoning in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, this power can be defined by, the raw power of it, the attack and the defense being the life of the card, and of course that one goes down depending on how much it gets hit, while the attack of course is the value of damage it does to a character's health or the enemy's health, so to say. There's not health points for the main player as much as there is a balance, they call it. Basically, the way it works is when you attack directly, it places some weights based on the amount you've attacked for on the opposite side of the scale. And when it topples, well, the side that it toppled for, they lose. I will say this is immediately one of my first complaints with this game, because it does feel like the amount needed to topple an enemy feels very low, and the same goes to you because it's the same amount. And the problem that brings is that if you have a bad first hand, which is bound to happen in a roguelike deck building game where the balance and quality of your deck has a lot of RNG going into it, does make it so, a lot of the times you can just kind of have a bad hand and make it very hard to, get over or survive in general. And on the other side of the coin, it also meant that I found myself doing a lot of, and not to keep with the Yu-Gi-Oh references, but FTK or OTK decks, because since they already don't have that much health, it's quite easy to, if you have a well built deck, to completely topple them in one turn, which I found myself doing a lot by upgrading lower, weaker characters that don't require tributing, and then, just being able to just absolutely flood the field with them to, add up to more than 6 damages, which is all that this game needs to topple a player. Of course, the thing adding to this is that if you're already on the losing side, it also makes it a lot easier to recover, because you're not just adding the weight to topple the player, you're also taking the one from your side, which I always thought is a weird dynamic for a card game or for any game where they make it actually hard to come back when you're already losing. And on one side I do understand, because if it didn't have this scale system, the game would be fairly easier, and also the scale system is a pretty unique system, but it also brings the problem that if you did try to make the scales a lot bigger, and as in just going for a lot longer, that means that also coming back from a bad position would be even bigger of a task. It also doesn't help that, of course, the decks are fairly small for the most part, which in that way it actually helps creating a more balanced deck, but it also means it's very quick to run out of cards. A strategy you can most definitely do in this game is simply, destroy all your enemy's cards, and then he will have to give up, which he does when he finds himself outnumbered. Now, continue on this thing with the difficulty. There's also a life system, sort of. Basically you have 2 lives, which is represented by a candle, which, by the way, very cool. Most things in this game are represented through actual objects in the game, even though this is a card game and they could have gone with something more virtual or fake. No, everything exists in the world, like the candles, which is your lives, which, by the way, they automatically get reduced to 1 when you enter a boss fight, which I think is annoying, but I also get what they're going for. And also, once you finish the boss fight, it does recover your health to 2, even if you had already lost 1 in the previous area. Now, other in-world items that help you in this game are also things like scissors or a knife, cards in a jar which you can break and just get that card, which is useful, of course. The Caesar cuts a card, which of course is useful because it's basically an insta-destroy kind of thing. There's also a plier that helps you tip the scales by removing something, but not from the scale. I'll leave you to figure that one out, but it is a bit gruesome. Regardless, as we speak about this, we also have then, of course, the world outside of the playing card game where you're trying to escape. Basically, you can get up from the card game and explore the room in kind of a dungeon crawly controls type of thing, where you work in steps and positions, and then you can change in 45-degree angles, and basically, giving you a look into different puzzles or different things in the room that might help you escape or change something. Things like finding other cards that are also sentient and that will talk to you and help you. You can also get new items that help you again in the gameplay of the cards, and hopefully later on enough things that they help you simply defeat the mysterious adversary. But that isn't really the end of the game, is it? In fact, that's really just a third of the game. That being said, the game very much sticks to this roguelike type of playing game, maybe ditching a bit of the rogue and focusing more on deck building, but that's all I'm gonna say without spoiling. The other thing I'm gonna say, trying to spoil as least as possible, is that the presentation of the game changes immensely. But to give you some idea of what you might be expecting is, the second style of game you'll see is not the final style of game you'll see. So even after that, there's still more to come. So it's a spoiler to say that there's a twist in this game, but it's almost impossible not to mention that something is gonna happen, especially when it happens only about a third of the way into the game. So just be aware that when this game feels like it's ending and you're on that first part, you're not even close. All I'm gonna say is, this story of being kidnapped is honestly nothing compared to the story of YouTubers who open card packs. That's all I'm gonna say. And I'm already being too cheeky and too spoilery. Regardless, I guess that leads us to talk about the presentation of the game, which makes it quite hard because of the way the game is presented. But I will say that the game is, again, immensely great at contextualizing everything within the game itself. there's not really a UI. The UI is the game. From the example of the scale representing your points or the items being actual items on the table that you're playing with, and the cards themselves being sentient and talking to you, which I think is so unique and so much more interesting than, for example, just finding a random piece of paper or audio log in a bookcase or something to give you exposition. This game is by the developers of Pony Island, and honestly they have come a great way since then. I was not even a huge fan of Pony Island. I thought it was a bit gimmicky for the trends that were going on back at the time. The gameplay just wasn't fun to me. But I do think here it completely fixes both of those problems. The story is a lot more interesting, it's a lot more fun. Even if I think it doesn't really come to a very satisfying ending, it's still a very fun journey. And the gameplay, again, being a card game, does make it a lot more interesting to me than the puzzles that were in Pony Island. Which, you know, of course I'm a bit biased because I do enjoy card games, but also I think most people would agree that what's going on here is a lot more interesting in general. Now, on a more technical term, I do think this game has an incredible aesthetic. I was never like the textures of this are too low or they clash. Everything fits together really well. Pixelization and pixel art is used in a lot of clever ways to give a more purposefully retro style while still having modern graphics. But when I say modern graphics, I just mean 3D graphics, because I would say that had this game come out 2 years ago or 10 years from now, I still think I would have said it looked great. There isn't really a moment where I went, oh, that looks off, or that looks low res, or that looks unclean. Like I think I do with most games, it really does feel like it is very polished aesthetic wise. Now, soundtrack wise, I would say it's also very good. It definitely didn't hit me as hard as the visuals did, but it's still very fitting. You know, it adds to the mystery, it adds a level of tension. Honestly, with the way it kind of sounded, I thought this was actually a game from the developers of Hand of Fate, which I was very surprised to find out it wasn't. Also that and some of the animations of the cards, but I guess maybe animating cards in 3D, that's just what it looks like. Regardless, the sound is very somber, you know, it lingers, it has a lot of low notes. There's also a very strong presence of synths in a way that, you know, it adds to that kind of retro feel of the game without it actually being retro. It's not the type of music I would want to listen in my free time because it is kind of tense, you know, I'm being kidnapped and forced to play a card game kind of tense. But it really works for this game, doesn't it? Regardless, I've said most of what I wanted to say about this game. It is really good, and I do think you should go into it knowing as little as possible. Just know that, you know, if you like card games, you'll probably enjoy the gameplay here. If you don't like card games, it is a bit more of a gamble, but I do think it's still worth trying, especially if you're into roguelikes. And even if you're not into roguelikes, I think some of the weird things that happen in this game might actually change your mind on that, or at least on this game. Especially if you are into that Pony Island, you know, out-of-game experience that those games provided. Out-of-game sounds weird, but you get the idea. It's not quite AR, but it kinda tries to mess with you in a way to make you think that there's things happening outside of the executable file of this video game. Regardless, for those reasons and everything I said before, I am giving Inscryption an 8 out of 10. It's a great game, it's a very unique game, and I was, you know, very much in the need for that, and this really filled that in a good way. It's a completely different game, I don't think I've ever played anything like it, and for that it's getting that 8 out of 10. Recommendations wise, I already talked about it. The game goes for $20, which I think is very much an appropriate price for this length of game. It's about 15 hours, I want to say. More or less, depending how much you lose during the more roguelike scenes. But regardless, I do think you should try it, just because, you know, I think we should support games that are unique like this and that do take some kind of more unique artistic direction. I do really like the way this game looks and plays, and I'm very excited to see where they go next, because this is great, like I said. Regardless of whatever your decision is though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and even disliking now. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and if you kidnap me, please let me play some Yu-Gi-Oh! And goodbye.